I'm very glad to speak and to speak now because, in a sense, the topic of my talk is directly connected with the previous discussion, and notably the question of, I don't know you, I'm sorry, the lady...
My wife, Olena.
Ah, Ole. So, I don't want to put trouble in the Spanish family, but I can sum up my talk by saying that Olena is right and Alexei is wrong. But so we lack time, but I can't skip the most important thanks I wanted to express. First to Oksana, who invited me to this workshop, and second to Constantin Sigov. You know, I have a lot of connections and fruitful dialogues with Ukrainian intellectuals, and roughly, it's most of the time, if not all the time, thanks to Constantin, and I am grateful for that. So, let's come to the period of Jews in Ukraine is, I think, a major casualty of the ban on Ukraine history in Soviet times. Legends and stereotypes on Ukrainian anti-Semitism are a plague, probably as painful as is the denial of Holodomor. Yet, the relationship along centuries between Jews and Ukrainians is a crucial dimension of the national narrative in this country, but I dare to say also of the European narrative. We need to free the history of genocides of the 20th century from prejudices and legends. It is essential to the building of a shared memory, and that's not easy. It's a point of my talk. First point, let's remember that the majority of the citizens, with quotation marks, of the Yiddish land lived on the territory of Ukraine today. This work has been destroyed. Is it doomed to oblivion? And Ukraine doomed to be guilty first of the crime and then of the oblivion, as if the Ukrainian and not the Nazis committed the crime, and as if the Ukrainian and not the Soviets the oblivion. This way of spelling things amounts to a huge injustice. But it discloses also a genuine complication I would like to deal with. The fact that the crime happened for the most part on the spot, amid Ukrainian society, and not in the remote secrecy of extermination facilities, far away from the living space of the victims, make the Ukrainian theater of the Shoah an unprecedented drama. The characters of the criminal, the collaborator, the bystander, let's say the indifferent bystander, the concerned bystander, the righteous, take an unprecedented intensity. They are, so to speak, multiplied by these extreme conditions, the risk on the spot. Nothing remotely comparable is to be found in what experienced the French, the Dutch, even the Poles during the Nazi occupation. Furthermore, this history is also a history censored by the Soviet times, and as I learned from my colleague Yaroslav Gritsak, more heavily in Ukraine than everywhere in the Soviet Empire. Even in some republics, there was at some time in the 60s or 70s some discussions about the Holocaust. It was always locked in Ukraine. And this censorship is even more disastrous since Ukraine is the site of the crime. And the fact that it is the site, or one of the main sites of the crime, creates special responsibilities, special guilt, special questions, as well as exceptional heroic commitments. And of course, it's a huge trauma, disproportionate to what happened in the countries where the final solution consisted in persecution, deportations, but the slaughter itself being remote. The burden of being directly present at the crime scene and the burden of forbidden history in Soviet times are the two obstacles to a shared memory, to a common narrative. The Ukrainian collective memory must face the fact of direct presence with all its consequences in matter of involvement, complicity, as in matter of heroism. In paradoxical situations like this one, the condition of ordinary life, of common decency, are not only altered, they are destroyed. 2, and for the west of the country, even 3 occupations penalized violence and created a dislocation of morals to an extent one cannot figure out. The paroxysm consists in the fact that the least act of charity is a matter of life and death. The least act of indifference is abject, or at least may have lethal consequences. In Ukraine, the Nazi moral breakdown of society came after a Soviet moral breakdown, a world of suspicion where everyone is forced to inform on everyone. The least compromise, for instance, to take a job in the police to avoid work deportation in Germany, could lead you to the most ugly criminal complicity. All the last feature, all the reactions, the various reactions of people to the persecution against Jews was over-determined by fear. It's something very difficult to understand from outside, and I would like to mention Aaron Appelfeld's novel Mariana's Bedroom, who expressed such a predicament in a very sensitive way. The story of a Jewish boy hidden by a prostitute who is a former schoolmate and friend of his mother during the occupation in Galicia. And all the characters are immersed in fear. Fear is ubiquitous. Mariana, who is devoted to the boy, the concierge of the brothel who is a fierce anti-Semitic informer, other people who are torn between Christian charity and fear. Such a burden, such a responsibility experienced by the Ukrainians are difficult to understand from a Western point of view. It is impossible to skip it by running away by an embarrassed silence. Ukrainians have a duty of remembrance and explicit narrative to which they cannot escape. But it's unfair to ask to Ukrainians alone, as a titular nation, so to speak, to do this job. Because the ignorance and myth surrounding the Shoah in Ukraine, and therefore the memory and legacy of the Shoah as such, require a repair. I intend the word reparation, repair, not in a judicial or penitent meaning, but in the very mechanical sense of the expression. And this repair requirement is addressed to everyone, including the Jews, as outrageous as it can seem at first sight. There are indeed 2 ways to erase history and to manipulate collective memory. Denial is the most obvious, but not always the most dreadful. There is also what I would like to call the dismantling of history by legends and stereotypes. Legends and stereotypes are inherent to collective memory, but they become dismantling, destructive, only under certain conditions. This happens when they reach a pervasive, a global level, so that some facts are mentioned, but always in a twisted and partial way, to the effect that the fabric of the string of events and circumstances disappears. This is what happened to the history of pogroms in Ukraine at the end of the First World War. And I skip the passage. The situation is the same with the collaboration and Jewish queuing during Nazi occupation. If you read the best historians of the subject, for instance, in a recent book, The Shoah in Ukraine, and I think notably to the contribution of Professor Frank Olszewski, even those who know almost everything are extremely cautious as to how many righteous, how many collaborators, how many perpetrators, how many bystanders there was. On this issue, that's my second point, like in some other in history, we stumble up against what I call the vertigo of verification. There are conditions of uncertainty about facts, beyond which, between lies and ignorance, one cannot be sure of anything, when even the most ascertained beliefs happen to be wrong or even deceiving. There is no basic facts, for instance, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, which one can rely on to check further facts, to interpret them, since the most granted facts may prove to be legend. And for that matter, the most entrenched one is certainly the belief, very strong in my country and in some other country, I think, that Simon Péturas is the main responsible of the pogroms of 1919. Meanwhile, he was among the leaders of the Republic, of the Ukrainian Republic, one of the most attached to the friendship and alliance, political alliance between Ukrainian and Jews. Few narratives are as much encumbered by myth, legends, false, unverified, or worse, twisted. If even the most warranted facts may turn to be false, how can we rely on what we read, what we learn, what we hear? There is here a philosophical point. Cartesian doubt is not an available method. If we cannot be sure whether Caesar crossed or not the Rubicon, we cannot be certain of anything regarding the history of the Roman Republic. We cannot have any faith in Sueton narrative and even in material sources which could have been forged. But by dismissing every information, you throw the baby out with the bathwater, and any thought, any establishment of fact becomes impossible. I could have explained this point through Gadamer's or Heidegger theory of pre-comprehension, but I'm more familiar and more at home with Wittgenstein's view on certainty. Wittgenstein said that if, excuse me, the questions that we raise and our doubts depend on the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubt, are, as it were, like hinges on which those questions turn. And before he said, the game of doubt itself presupposes certainty. It is the work of scholars and witnesses to fill the gaps, to piece together the narrative, that is, to make it right. But what does this mean, making the narrative right? Does it mean balanced, fair, thorough? I would rather say global. There is a very useful English expression for that. the big picture. Reaching the big picture of something. My purpose is to understand better this peculiar situation where we lack of the big pictures. If you want, it's a special case of reconciliation, which is not reconciliation between conflicting memories, but reconciliation between lacking memories. Now, what is in this context the problem of stereotypes? Stereotypes are not necessarily nasty, or as the black legend of Ukrainian native fierce anti-Semitism, or the cliché of Ukraine's Jews as always traitors serving the Poles and the Russians rulers, the Pole and the Russian rulers, sorry. Some stereotypes are softer, even benevolent, and nevertheless unsatisfying, because they freeze the common life of Jewish and Ukrainian nations. They reduce identities to sociological determinism. Poles are landlords, Ukrainians are peasants, Jews are traders, etc. No, Jews and Ukrainians are not, quotation mark, social groups. Social groups determined by their position in a dominated scheme. They are individuals, they are living communities, stumbling upon each other in various ways. If I may say so, our understanding of social relationship should not be so Marxist. And there is a standard representation of Jews in Eastern Europe, and notably in Ukraine, as bound, because they were a diaspora, to be oriented towards the dominant group, Poles or Russians in our case, rather than the colonized Ukrainians. However partially true and benevolent, this representation goes wrong. If we are to fight stereotypes on Ukraine or any subject, we must do it also in our method. That is, not to indulge in the fascination for average figures, great figures, statistics, as if only the common, the average, was the only relevant reality. Unique facts can be as socially significant, if not more, and disclose precious ideas on collective consciousness. Meanwhile, average are often no more than stereotypes checked by science. In the expanded version you will have in written form of this paper, I deal at length with the character of Ivan Franko, Ukraine's national writer, relying heavily on a very interesting study by Jaroslav Hitsak, A Strange Case of Anti-Semitism. And it is because precisely because Franco was a great intellectual and political figure that he offers us an illuminating report, not only on himself, but on what I would like to call Ukraine's relationship with Jewish society. At every step of his thought, I sum up the conclusion of my reading of Franco and Witzak. At every step of his thought, the Jewish question is not for Franco never a racial nor a religious issue. It's a national one. I would like to say rather a political one. You know that Franco had various opinions, and I would say feelings towards the Jew during his life. He was, so to speak, an anti-philo-Semitic man, if this makes sense. But be they considered as alien or friends, in need of assimilation, or as a political nation on the same footing as the Ukrainian one, Jews are a nation, a political community, with its various interests, its identity, its different political parties fighting one against each other. And Franco is interested in the relation that a free Ukraine could build with this nation. And beyond politics, there is, even in his painful writings on the Jewish question, a Jewish, sorry, beautiful slip of the tongue, a genuine curiosity. This curiosity for such a strange nation is, I believe, something typically Ukrainian. It's a political conception and practice of nations that gives its peculiar color to the Ukrainian Jewish conversation. And this is a potential rather than the obstacles I mentioned before. But what remains of this conversation after the disaster? There is no more Jewish nation in Europe. This will be my last point. And I would like to quote a recent paper by Taras Wozniak, my friend Taras Wozniak, on Galician culture in a recent article. We shall never be able to have the Poles, the Germans, the Jews, or the Czechs back in Galicia. But their cultural legacy must be taken care of. And whose duty should this be, if not the current inhabitants of Lviv, Ternopil, or Kolomia, since there is no one else? The answer is therefore unequivocal. We Ukrainians, are accountable for the Jewish, Polish, Austrian cultural legacy in Galicia. There are indeed small national communities, but they are not strong enough. Besides, the current inhabitants of Galicia need it in the first place. So, of course, the paroxysm of extermination and the destruction forever of the Jewish land makes harder the building of a shared memory. But Ukrainian history, including its darkest moments, bears also a rich potential, and I feel that there is a secret affinity between those two nations who managed during centuries to exist, not to cease to exist as nations, that is, as political being aiming at autonomy, even without state, even under foreign rulers, or for the Jews, even without their own territory. Such a conversation is yet as not rich as it could be, and Jews and Ukrainians have their share in this situation. Our stories are incomplete, one without the other, says the beautiful motto of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Association, international association created in Canada. How can we reach a mutual recognition of the Jewish part of Ukrainian history and of the Ukrainian part of Jewish history? It requires from the Jews the duty of historical revision. Courage is needed to figure out and admit the extent of the Black Legend and the Soviet forgeries. Everything is to be verified. This does not mean that nothing happened, no pogroms, no collaboration, no opportunistic plunder and denouncing. But the legend distorts even the real. A full reparation requires a global history, able to weight every light and every shadow and to cast them in their proper context. Yet, you must begin somewhere, and I believe that the reconsideration of the figures of Bishop Szeptycki and of Simon Petua are the inescapable point of departure, the bridgehead, so to speak, of this effort. From the Ukrainian side, it requires a duty of understanding. Understanding of what? Acknowledge the uniqueness of the Shoah. I would say not despite, but thanks to the evils suffered by Ukraine. This uniqueness is based on the final scope of the extermination. Everybody, and not only a great amount of them. second, on its purely ideological ground, but also and foremost on the irremediable destruction of the Jewish land here. And this requires to have tact with interlocutors in the dialogue. So, this is my conclusion. The Jews should measure the injustice of the anti-Semitic legend and the sufferings it provokes, the interest it served, today as in Soviet times, and the Ukrainians must understand better the radical aspect of the loss and the ethical consequences for them of the fact that it happened at home. Let me conclude by underlining the beautiful junction of two words in the quotation of Taras: duty and need. The duty of Ukrainians to include the Jewish legacy in their national narrative is also a need. Thank you.
Уважаемые коллеги, если вопросы по докладу, пожалуйста. Как обычно, несколько вопросов для затравки. Я понимаю, что, может быть, если возникли по ходу вопросы, да, пожалуйста, Алексей.
I guess I will formulate the question in Russian for the audience. Or better, на каком языке? Давайте я по-русски скажу, да? Я хотел попросить вас сравнить. There is translation? Я хотел попросить профессора де Лара сравнить две позиции, две философии молчания. И, может быть, предположить третью позицию, если она возможна. Вот профессор де Lara вспоминал Wittgensteina, у которого, кроме презумпции, для игры в сомнение всегда должно быть нечто несомненное, у него еще есть презумпция, что для говорения всегда нужна зона молчания, нужна зона несказанного. Не просто того, что не сказано, а того, о чем невозможно сказать. Это достаточно вспомнить последнюю фразу трактата, да? Невозможно говорить, если мы не отталкиваемся от чего-то, о чем невозможно сказать. С другой стороны, сегодня уже упоминали Мартина Бубера, и его отношение к молчанию, это тоже необходимый сущностный компонент философии Бубера. Но вот проблема в том, я хотел об этом спросить профессора де Lara, что Wittgenstein и Бубер, они молчат очень по-разному. Для Wittgensteina молчание такое спокойное, поправьте меня, если я не прав, и скорее терапевтическое, он молчанием лечит. Бубер, наоборот, это напряженное, очень этически напряженное молчание, он скорее мучается этим молчанием, но он его проживает, и проживает мучительно, но без него тоже нельзя. Вот в том, что говорит профессор де Lara об отношениях к Шоа и к этой исторической памяти, есть ли здесь зона молчания, и если да, то это зона терапевтического молчания или зона молчания проживаемого мучителя? Спасибо. Или какое-то...
I think there are two Wittgensteins, and the second one would not stick to the ethics of silence of Tractatus, but rather to another motto, which is nothing is hidden. And I'm closer, as you guess, to the second position than to the first. And concerning our topic, I think that silence is not an option. And on the contrary, we need this global building of the big picture to share memories and get to, I don't like the word reconciliation in this case, because I think, of course, I know it's not the purpose of this meeting, but there is a possible bias in the concept of reconciliation, which is to refer exclusively to enemies or people who are made wrong to each other. And in this case, it is not the purpose, at least the main purpose of reconciliation. As I said, the core of reconciliation is not as much reconciliation of conflicting memories as the reconciliation of lacking memories.
Уважаемые коллеги, еще вопрос, пожалуйста.
Спасибо, профессор, за вашу лекцию, за доклад. У меня такой вопрос, мы видим даже на примере Одессы, о том, что коммеморация еврейской жертвы на Украине, она идет исключительно снизу, она идет из частных инициатив, в первую очередь еврейских общин, родственников. Мы видим, что большинство усилий в образовательном плане осуществляется при помощи тех же самых частных инициатив. Это спонсорство, это Украинский центр изучения Холокоста в Киеве, очень большой и достаточно активно работающий по многим ФСБКам, который в течение 10 лет много сделал для популяризации этой темы через задействование школьных учителей. И мы видим очень отстраненную позицию государства, собственно говоря, официальной власти, которая по сей день существует, потому что в конце мая был небольшая конференция, где присутствовал министр образования современный, и он сказал, что он совершенно не в теме, и не проявлял никакого интереса, не сказал, что пойдет на встречу, но тем не менее позволил себе через 20 минут после своего выступления уйти. Вот, собственно говоря, ваша точка зрения, какое должно быть место государства вот в этом включении примирения, в этом включении памяти, потому что оно до сих пор очень открыто. Мы видим, что снизу идет, но этот процесс достаточно медлительный. За 25 лет, конечно, было много сделано. Было много памятников открыто, было много связано с деятельностью французского священника Патрика Дебуа, чью книгу Духлита издавала, вот, и который открывал очень много памятников. Вот. Но тем не менее, как-то высшие инстанции остаются глухи. Это так и должно оставаться, и нужно как-то влиять. Спасибо.
Well, as I said, there are two very negative legacies from Soviet times. The first one is the ban on history, what I call the forbidden history of Ukraine. If Ukraine doesn't exist, which is the Soviet statement, there is no Ukraine history. That's the first burden. And the second is the concurrence of victims, which is fueled. It's not typically Soviet. Everywhere in the world there has been massacres, genocide, and the temptation, including in our democratic countries, of the concurrence of victims. If we speak too much of the Jews, we will forget the Armenians, etc., blah, blah, blah. But I think there is a specific Soviet source of this attitude, which must be fighted. And it's true that until now, memory in independent Ukraine has been liberated but separated. And if I had to sum up my talk in practical directions, I would say the Jews have to recognize they were trapped by the Soviets concerning Sheptitsky and Petliura, and the Ukrainians must understand they must get rid of the awful monuments of Babi Yar. The fact that Babi Yar is a mixed up of several initiatives, monuments, Ukrainian Jews, government, Brezhnev, foreign Jews, I don't know whom. It's a kind of a layer cake of memories and events. There should be one Babi Yar with an intelligible unity of the place. And maybe I would like to conclude. I wanted to do that and I forgot after. A great and maybe a little too much forgotten Ukrainian author with Anatoly Kuznetsov, who wrote a magnificent book on Babi Yar. I would say that Kuznetsov is really the, how to say that, a pocket Vasily Grossman. I mean, he didn't tell the whole story of the war, but only from the point of view of a kid living in the Babi Yar neighborhood. But his book has the same breadth and deep meaning on the nature of the events that occurred there, the connection between the Nazis and the Soviets, the relation of the Ukrainian society, reactions of Ukrainian society to the Holocaust, etc. It's really a great book, and you certainly know the tragic fate of this book, which was published, but in a heavily censored, revised version in Soviet Union, and this almost, I think, killed Kuznetsov, who fled to the West, published the authentic version of his book with all the sentences censored. It's very interesting to read that, but unfortunately he didn't write anything else, to my knowledge, and he died rather quickly. And I think we should remember more than we do this great figure of Euro-literature.
Спасибо. Уважаемые коллеги, еще один вопрос, может быть, к докладчику. Если вопросов нет, поблагодарим еще раз профессора де Lara.